organization does. World Affairs Councils of America is a national, non-governmental organization dedicated to foreign affairs, current events, foreign policy, and global issue education. Upstate International is a member of that organization, and our goal is to bring expertise and allow our local residents to ask their own questions and really become involved and educated in these issues. We are non-political, non-partisan. So all of the opinions that we bring to you are to let you have the broadest perspective that we can on any given topic. So if you're not a part of our organization already, I would welcome you to come and check us out, take a look at our website. You can find the World Affairs Council Upstate at upstateinternational.org. Give us a call and talk to us and find out how you can learn more, participate more, and help us really broaden perspectives here in the upstate of South Carolina. It's a really important thing to do, and we would welcome your participation and support to making all of these events possible to the public. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob Rowan, our steering board chair.
Okay, hey, I'm excited to welcome you all to this timely event that we're having. I want to thank the team at the World Affairs Council Upstate, and we will continue to put on this in the next couple of months, more of these webinars on things that are going to be very exciting topics. This one I think will be, like the rest of them, a great hit, but if anybody would like to support this, we could use your support to put your name on it. So if your company or you personally feel like I want to be part of this, we would love to have you be a sponsor. I want to introduce our group that we have today. Our moderator, who is Elizabeth Feather, is somebody who serves on the board of the World Affairs Council Upstate, representing Upstate Alliance. She's the director there at the Research and Strategic Initiatives for the Upstate South Carolina Alliance, and responsible for directing and executing research efforts that go to position the organization as the go-to for information on business and other issues that face us. She's part of the Upstate's participation in Global Cities Exchange, which is a joint partnership of the Brookings Institute and JP Morgan. So she's been there since 2011, after 11 years with GSA Business Report, and is a graduate of the Honors College at the College of Charleston. Then we have two great professors who are going to lead this discussion. Visiting from the Gulf Coast of Florida, Thomas Smythe is a professor of finance and in the Department of Economics and Finance. He joined Florida Gulf Coast University in 2019 after serving 18 years at Furman, okay, so local. He had spent 4 years in the Army as an engineer officer and had tours of duty in Honduras and Costa Rica. After leaving the Army in 1989, he worked for Mobil Oil for almost 7 years as a systems and business analyst. He has an MBA from George Mason University, which he got while working there for Mobil. Since finishing his PhD at the University of South Carolina, he has published numerous articles in both academic and practitioner journals. I've been quoted for his work in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, USA Today, Consumer Reports, Money Magazine, CNN Money, Chicago Tribune, Associated Press, NBC News, Miami Herald. If you're not impressed, I am very impressed, okay? He teaches corporate finance, money, and capital markets and banking, and his research focuses on mutual funds and individual financial literacy and planning. Perfect for what we're talking about today. And then, of course, my good friend Brent Nelsen, also from Furman University, is somebody you may have having heard before. And he has his BA from Wheaton in 1981 and his PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin. He began teaching at Furman in 1990 and has served as a chair of the political science from 2003 to 2009. His teaching and focus and scholarship is on Europe and the European Union, and he's teamed up with Alexander Stubb, and this is really impressive, one of his former students and now also a former Prime Minister of Finland. So that's pretty good. They published a textbook called European Union Readings on Theory and Practice of European Integration. It's in its 4th edition. So Since 2001, his focus has been on religion and politics, and the Georgetown Press University has published a major work that he did. He also has a little bit of political background. He ran unsuccessfully for the state superintendent of education, but Governor Nikki Haley did appoint him as chair of Educational Television Commission. And also President Obama nominated him to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Board of Directors. So he is a person who's respected widely, and I'm really excited to have both of them talking along with Elizabeth Feather. So at this point, let me turn over the horizontal and the vertical to our staff, and so we get on with this webinar and inform us. And thank you again for all coming today.
Thanks, everybody. So glad to have you with us. Before we kick off the discussion, just thanks everybody for attending. Each of our presenters will present for about 15 minutes, then we'll turn it over to question and answers. For all the attendees, to pose a question, please use the chat function, which will be found at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions, and we'll pretty much try to follow the order of posing. And just to kind of clean up our views, if all attendees wouldn't mind turning off your video, that would be very helpful. And just to double check that you are muted so that we can eliminate any background noise for our presenters. Thank you so much. During the presentation, if we're sharing slides, you can move the speaker image over and adjust it by clicking the little boxes on the top of the left hand of the speaker image. So hopefully that will end the housekeeping notes, get those out of the way, and just a request to the team for patience. This is my first time moderating a Zoom meeting, so hopefully I'm not going to screw it up too badly. But we're really excited about the discussion, and to kick things off, let me turn it over to Brent. And Brent, just let me know when you're ready for your slides.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. This is really exciting to do something like this. I often like to be in the same room with my audience. I don't get that opportunity, but I see actually a lot of familiar names and a lot of familiar faces. So I appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon for what I think will be a really good discussion. I'm going to start talking, but Tom is going to jump in, and then eventually I'm going to turn it over to him. So if Elizabeth could now share the screen and our slide deck with the rest of the folks, we can get started here. And she's working on that. Aha. I think the slide, if you go down to the bottom, you'll see the screen, little screen icon, and click that, yeah. Aha, very nice. Okay, we're going to have to do a little tag team here. So Elizabeth, please advance. We are bracing for impact, and we're going to look at the coronavirus and the global economy. In this talk, we want to talk about, we've sort of divided it into sections. So we want to look at the effect of the coronavirus on 3 different aspects of the global economy. So you can advance to the next one. We're going to look at the international production system. That is, how do we produce the goods that we get? And I'm going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about international trade, and I'll talk about that as well. And then Tom is going to finish up this substantive section with international finance. And then we're going to talk about the big picture. You can advance it. We're just going to kind of ask some of the really big questions that we need to ask about how the virus is affecting the global economy and what questions we need to ask when looking to the future. And then finally, we're going to have you all ask questions, and that should be the most interesting part. So you can advance that, and then on to the next slide. right now, I want to give you a sense of what our methodology is going to be to try to make our way through this really huge topic. So just put up the next 3 questions. How do we proceed with limited information? Well, the first thing we're going to do is ask, what are we observing now in the global economy? Can we see a few things? We get a news reports, and we've got a tiny bit of data. We really don't have very much data to know exactly what's going on. So we're going to ask, what are we observing now? And then we're going to ask, can we connect these observations to trends that we have previously detected before the coronavirus pandemic started? It is our notion that the coronavirus will amplify certain trends that we saw previously and maybe leave some others to the side. So then the last question is, how will those long-term trends, or which one of those long-term trends will be amplified by the pandemic? So observe, ask what trends did we see previously, and then ask what might this pandemic do to amplify some of those long-term trends. Okay, let's start with the first substantive section here. We're going to talk about international production. And again, this is how things are produced and where those things are produced. And this process deals with terms such as supply chains and offshoring and foreign direct investment. These are some of the topics that we use. So you can, some of the terms that we use. So a supply chain is simply a process of getting various raw materials, turning them into parts, and then turning them into some sort of final product. And those different separate processes can occur anywhere around the world. And then through international trade, they come to the place where they're going to be sold. So we know something about supply chains over the last 50 years. We've seen supply chains become longer and longer. That means a lot of parts are made in faraway places like China before they're shipped to maybe the United States, where they're assembled into products, or they're assembled someplace and brought to the United States to be sold. And we know that these supply chains have gotten longer and much more diverse and complicated. And we want to ask, well, what effect has the coronavirus had on supply chains? Well, I'm going to make 2 observations. First, it seems pretty clear that our supply chains have become too dependent on China. And we saw that first with the Wuhan outbreak. Suddenly, a lot of our supply chains were broken because the industries were shut down in central China. So, that was a problem, and companies began to think, wow, we really need to be more diverse in where our supplies come from. So too dependent on China. And then we also had become very dependent on just-in-time delivery. That is, we can think about the BMW plant here in Spartanburg. A lot of the parts come in the morning and are put into the cars in the afternoon. Companies don't need to store lots of products. They don't need to have a lot of supplies on hand. Those things are just seamlessly brought together in a single process that brings everything together in a very short period of time. Well, a virus breaks out and you find out you can't get some of those products and you don't have anything in a warehouse. So now you start thinking, well, maybe just-in-time delivery has some downsides to it, and we might not be able to get our product out. So those are a couple of observations. If we look at some of the trends that were occurring before the coronavirus, well, we could already see that there was some trend towards reshoring some of these products. That means bringing the supply chain back to the United States and taking some of those companies, some of those processes that were in China back to the United States. We do see, though, that a lot of that requires more high-tech processes, maybe more robotics, because we don't want to pay labor such a high price, and that's why we went to China to begin with. So now we've got to, if we're going to bring it back here, we've got to change the process a little bit and make it less labor dependent. So we were seeing some of that. I think we're going to see more of that as we go forward. We're also going to see some regionalization of supply chains. We were seeing that before as companies decided, well, we don't want our supply chain to be so long. So it might not be in China or Vietnam. We just want our suppliers to be in Mexico, a little bit closer. So instead of having a global supply chain, we'll have a regional supply chain. And then finally, there's kind of been what I would call a strategic decoupling within some of these supply chains. We've noticed that we are vulnerable strategically to companies like Huawei in China, which supplies a lot of our high-tech products that are used in the defense industry, or now more in the healthcare industry with pharmaceuticals or personal protection equipment, things like that. We suddenly realize, whoa, those things are really important for us. They are strategic in value, and we need to have those supply chains much closer to home. So that was a trend that was occurring a little bit before coronavirus. I think that's going to be magnified as well. So supply chains, I think, are changing. We can just briefly talk about offshoring. We've already said there's going to be a reshoring, maybe more diversification of countries that are used in our supply chains, not just focused on China, but maybe diversifying to India, to Sub-Saharan Africa, other places, and regionalization. Tom's going to talk much more about foreign direct investment, but foreign direct investment, that is sending money from the United States to another country to build a factory or to buy something there. In a recession, that decreases, so we think that's going to go down. That also means you're idling a lot of labor in other parts of the world. And I think that is going to be a major problem in the future, because that means poverty will increase in the global south. Multinational corporations, I think, are going to do very well. The bigger, the better, and the more high tech, the better. We can talk more about that later. Winners and losers, you can go to the next slide, or the next animation, and just go ahead. Put up all the rest. I think we're going to see some winners and losers out of this whole process. Producers and consumers are both going to find things are going to change. Producers, their costs are going to rise because bringing those supply chains home means less efficiency in the system, and consumers are going to see higher prices. That is the cost of regionalizing or reshoring industries to the United States. Next animation. Certain sectors are going to do better than others. I think we're going to see certain sectors like the healthcare industry, robotics, some high-tech industry, anything that has to do with using data to track people or to understand their health needs. Those are going to be industries that are going to do very, very well. And there are going to be a lot of industries that are going to do less well. Tom and I have already been talking about education. It is going to be tough to keep colleges going in a coronavirus era until we have a some kind of vaccine, it's going to be difficult to pull classes together, and that is going to really shake up liberal arts schools, and Tom is in a state school as well. Okay, next slide. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. International trade, we're going to do this a lot faster because I think there are going to be fewer things to talk about here. Go ahead and advance it. What will the coronavirus have effect on trade volume? Well, it's just going to go down. We're going to see a decline in the value of goods going across borders. In terms of geography, well, if the supply chains regionalize, then we're going to see fewer goods coming from long distances and more goods coming from short distances. So there will be a regionalization of trade. And this connects to a trend we've already seen, which is the global trade regime, or the way we govern our global trade system, has been run primarily through the World Trade Organization, which is a global entity. But that has already been weakened, partly by the failure of countries to come to a new agreement on a lot of important issues that had stagnated the negotiation process, but also the rise of regional trade agreements. NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, is only the best example of that. But there's a new agreement in the Pacific. Of course, you have the European Union. The Chinese are building the Belt and Road Initiative, which is tying Asia together. So we're seeing regions of the world governing their own little trade systems. Winners and losers, go ahead and advance it all. Again, I think we're going to see more inefficiencies among producers, but some are going to do better than others. And again, consumer prices are going to go up because the system just isn't as efficient. The sectors that will do well will remain those who are open to trade, but it won't be trade as widely dispersed as possible, as usual, or under our former globalization system. And then the closed sectors are going to be probably doing even worse. So it means you need to be in a business that is open to at least as much trade as possible. And how is that going to affect the world? Well, the industrialized North always does better. The global South is probably going to have a lot of problems. They are labor intensive, and if the industries leave areas that use low-cost labor and bring all that back to their regional areas, that means there's going to be a rise in poverty in the global South because there just aren't the jobs there that there used to be. And let me just finish by touching on South Carolina. I think we're well placed to do well in a new global environment because we already have industries that are open to the world. But it probably means that we're going to have trouble recruiting the kind of skilled labor that we need unless our education system improves. And there's going to be a wider gap between those who are employed in these high-tech, globally open industries and those who are relatively stuck in the service sector. So I would predict an even greater inequality in South Carolina between the skilled labor and those who are unskilled. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
All right, thanks, Brent. Elizabeth, you go ahead and advance. This slide sort of lays it all out. Before I talk about international finance, I want to stress a couple of points that Brent was making as it applies to international production, international trade, very specifically. One that I'm not sure U.S. citizens are really grasping yet. So as as Brent talked about, sort of this repatriation of the supply chain back towards the United States, or if I'm someone in Europe, repatriating it back to Europe. The cost of that, as Brent pointed out, is going to be higher. That means the material cost is going to be higher, and there's a high probability eventually that those prices are going to be passed on to consumers. And this is because the global supply chain, the way we developed it, was meant to find the lowest cost source from raw materials through intermediate goods, and then also final goods and services. So a major outcome of this is likely to be higher prices. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't do it. As Brent pointed out, the strategic aspects of some of these industries, the healthcare industry, maybe steel and some others, may be that we need to have that productive capacity here in the United States, but we just need to be aware of what those trade-offs are. One of the other things that is a little bit harder to quantify in terms of a loss is that typically when we see repatriation or sort of nationalization of production, and I don't mean nationalization necessarily in a negative way, but just bringing things back into a country from a productive capacity, and very specifically protecting that productive capacity, whether it be through tariffs or quotas or some other type of arrangements, regional agreements. We also tend to see slower pace of innovation in those industries because those industries are not as directly affected by competition. So one of the things that sort of created a spike in innovation in the United States back in the late 70s and early 1980s is the introduction of foreign automobiles on a wide-scale basis. Prior to that time, American-made cars were not high quality, broke down a lot of high repair costs. The introduction of predominantly Japanese automobiles led to the American companies having to step up their game. And of course now, depending on the market niche, American cars are compatible from a quality perspective. So that competition leads to innovation in terms of quality products, but also a higher standard of living. So it's a little bit more abstract to be able to conceptualize, but it's a significant factor that we need to consider as we're making these choices with the supply chain. So to be able to build this supply chain, whether it's globally or regionally, or invest in new robotics, as Brent has talked about, the international financial system obviously has to be able to support that. What a lot of people don't realize is that sort of the globalization of markets really started with the financial markets. So back in the 1980s, when we were still negotiating the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, international money markets were already pushing the boundaries of engaging in transaction across international borders. One of the examples that I give my students is if you watch the original Wall Street movie, Charlie Sheen is in a scene where he's up at like 3 o'clock in the morning and he's trading currencies while the market is open in Asia. And so there was a big push in the financial markets, in large part because of the development of new telecommunications, that started to globalize those financial markets. Well, with the coronavirus, much like what we've seen with the trade aspect and production, we're going to see some impacts in the financial markets as well. One of the things that we're already seeing is sort of a reversal of some of the new banking regulations that have come out just in the last 3 or 4 years. The big one that was relaxed just a couple of weeks ago was one that required banks, starting in January of this year, to start estimating what the loss on a loan that they might provide would be over the entire life of the loan. Prior to that, banks only had to do that over the coming year. What that meant is that banks would then have to set aside more money under these new regulations than they would under the old system. And that's a direct outcropping of the 2008 financial crisis. The problem is if banks are having to set aside additional monies, that's less money that they have the capability to lend in the current situation. So at the international level, Bank of International Settlements, but also at the individual country or region level, most regulators have backed off of that and said, we're going to postpone that for another couple of years. What that means is there's a high probability we're going to address that under the presumption that when we get to a certain economic situation like we find ourselves, have we overstepped in terms of the banking system in ways that would, over the long term, hurt the capability of a country to be able to facilitate the flow of capital. So there's a high probability that some of these banking regulations are going to be revisited as we go forward. Another one that's been a little bit under the radar that the Federal Reserve announced about 4 weeks ago when it announced that it was going to do another emergency cut in interest rates of 1%. In the press release associated with it, down at the very bottom, there were about 3 sentences where the Federal Reserve has decided to eliminate reserve requirements on deposits. It's something that in my time as a finance professor, that's sort of a core piece of legislation or rulemaking that's been in place for about a century. And the idea, again, is that we want to give banks the capability to be able to provide the capital. Now, before you might panic, there's a belief from central bankers that the existing bank regulatory structure will protect the system in such a way that those reserve requirements may not be necessary. They may be outdated in today's environment. But going forward, then the question we face is, do we step back from that? Do we reimpose things like reserve requirements? Or are we going to be in this situation for an extended period of time, again, where we need to revisit some of the restrictive practices that we put on banks coming out of 2008? International capital markets, for the most part, probably are not going to be effective. And when I talk about capital markets here, I'm talking about issuing debt and equity stock in the public markets. Like prior to 1990, that market developed largely independent of what was going on from a production perspective. And it's highly unlikely in today's environment, especially with electronic trading and issuance of securities, that that's going to change. So companies should still be able to go out and raise capital both in their domestic markets, but also in international markets. And that's going to be critical as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic from an economic growth perspective. We really don't want to limit companies that may have new ideas from their ability to raise capital. Dominance of the dollar, one of the hot topics in the last 3 to 5 years has been, is the dollar still the dominant currency around the globe? And there were some strong arguments that the euro might be sort of creeping up on the dollar. That's died down a little bit in the last couple of years because of the Brexit situation. Both the pound and the euro have at different times sort of taken a beating. But one thing is for sure, when the coronavirus really took hold here in the US, what we found is that central banks around the globe rushed to buy dollar reserves, which would suggest that the dollar is still and will be the dominant currency around the globe for some time to come. Fundamentally, when people are fearful from a financial perspective, they tend to want to be in US markets. And as a result, the Federal Reserve had to set up a special program that allowed central banks from around the globe to access dollars. Of course, one of the big things that has occurred in the last 4 to 5 years is the idea of digital currency. I don't like to call it cryptocurrency, even though that's the standard currency, or excuse me, the standard terminology that's in parlance right now. But when I talk about a digital currency, I'm talking about getting rid of cash, and a currency that central banks might actually control. I think the coronavirus will speed up the investigation and the possible implementation of digital currencies by central banks around the globe. In fact, there is some reports that China is already moving towards electronification of their currency. And I really believe that there's going to be a first mover effect here. In other words, the one that gets out first from a central bank perspective could have an impact in sort of changing up the dominance of what we now think of as the dollar. So it would not surprise me at all within the next 10 years if we start moving to a digital currency, whereas prior to the coronavirus, I would have said probably not for 20 or 25 years. So I think that process is going to be sped up. Financial crises, I think, in today's environment are going to be centered around what happens in the debt markets, both at the sovereign level, but also at the individual company level. Unfortunately, going into the coronavirus, corporations around the globe were holding much more debt even prior to 2008. Hopefully, we'll be able to be able to transition them through some of the stimulus packages, but I foresee some credit market problems. And then, of course, we have to ask the question about the fact that we are essentially going to add about 25% to the US debt load literally overnight. I saw a projection just in the last couple of days that the deficit in the United States is likely to be very close to about $5 trillion this year. And our debt load coming into this year was about 23 trillion. At some point, that's got to have an impact on markets and economies around the globe. And of course, it's not just the US that's taking on those debt loads, it's other countries as well. Winners and losers, Brent has already mentioned this when he talked about multinational firms. We're already seeing a shakeout between big firms and small firms in a very generic sense. Firms that are larger, have a more diversified product line or service line, have international markets, are going to be able to weather the storm a lot better. But that's also why Congress is targeting the small business community with the Paycheck Protection Program. And hopefully we'll see small businesses be able to stay alive and therefore remain competitive. I also believe we're going to see some shakeouts in developing markets. Brent's already talked about sort of the industrial north and the global south. As we retrench some of those areas where we might have seen advances because of cheaper labor, some of those may start to dry up, and therefore we may see further distancing in terms of sort of the haves and have-nots. And I'm really talking at a national economic level, not necessarily at the personal level. So I think we can advance.
Yeah, advance, Elizabeth. And so we'll just ask some big picture questions here. Go ahead and advance. So when you're thinking about a big economic crisis like this, we have to ask questions about balances in the world. We were at a pretty important, interesting point prior to the coronavirus. Some things were beginning to shift already. We had a trade war going on. We had the United States even questioning its role in NATO. And so there was a lot of shifting going on. So a big crisis like this can really push things in a new direction. So when we're thinking about how this crisis is affecting the world, we have to ask, how will our expectations of government shift? My sense, and I'd be interested to hear what you all think, but I think there's going to be more of a focus on what can government do for us. The government is going to be more involved in healthcare. It's going to be more involved in even our jobs and how we're allowed to go back to work. I was reading just recently, yesterday in fact, about how in China, when workers go back to work, they're having to socially distance, and that means they can't even eat lunch together. They have to eat lunch behind cardboard boxes, and they have to take off their street clothes and put on company clothes when they come in. They have to have their temperature taken. Well, all of these things are going to be government ordered. And so there's going to be a shift in what we think about government, and we're going to look to government to make a lot of these decisions. How about our attitudes towards markets? I think among some people, there's a sense that the markets got us into this globalized position with our spread out supply chains and our dependence on trade and our dependence on the globe and offshoring and all of that. And maybe we need to think more seriously about how we regulate those markets. And Tom has already talked about some of that in the finance markets. And then the question is, will globalization continue? Or if it does continue, will it be shaped differently? I think that's a major question. And then finally, will the coronavirus impact the balance between state power and individual rights? How much of our individual rights are we going to give to the state to protect us from the coronavirus or whatever the next thing is that comes along? And one thing we do know is that after a big event like this, things are never exactly the same. We will never go back to normal. So there is a shift occurring now between government power and individual rights. How will that play out in the future? I think there's one more question there, Elizabeth. And maybe two. Go one more. Yeah, there we go. How will the global military balance change? If we're all regionalizing again, will the United States maintain its global dominance, or will we break up into regional pieces of the globe, with China dominating one part, the United States dominating another part, and maybe Europe/Russia dominating another? That's another big question. And then how will international cooperation change? Are we still going to be trying to manage things globally through the G7, through the G20. What will happen to the European Union? Will it strengthen because there's more cooperation to handle this pandemic, or will it fall apart? How about North America? Will we drive closer to our Mexican and Canadian allies, or will we find more to fight about? So I think these are shifting, and this coronavirus is definitely going to change things, but we're not exactly sure how they're going to change. Last slide, and go forward. And now we need your questions, because I'm sure we haven't covered everything that's in your mind. So Elizabeth, you take it over from here.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing, if that's okay. I don't think we'll need to go back to our slides. And our first question comes from Doug Stevens. He says, the IMF is saying the recession will be as bad as the Depression of 1930. If this proves to be the case, how difficult will it be for smaller companies to start back up and for the unemployed to find meaningful work?
Yeah, IMF's been putting out a lot of press releases in the last 2 or 3 days. I think we need to put context around that kind of statement, that this is going to be as bad as the Depression. First, going into this environment, at least here in the US and really globally, we were in a pretty good shape economically. Fundamentally, what's causing this drop-off is because we've literally told people that we want them to stay at home and not work. It's also the case that we have better tools today to be able to do things like help facilitate capital markets that we had no clue about back in the Great Depression. So some of the things that the Federal Reserve, whether you agree with them or not, that they've done in the last 3 weeks have fundamentally saved the financial system. Now, we are going to have indirect consequences, not all of them good, that result from that activity. But the fact that the Federal Reserve, learning from history, very specifically the Depression, has allowed them to take some steps that hopefully will facilitate us getting going much more quickly. Also, the stimulus package, I actually don't like the term stimulus. I'd prefer to call it the rescue, or the keep us from drowning, or whatever, because really what the stimulus package was geared to do was keep people on payrolls so that when we do get the opportunity to go back to work, we don't have to go through all of the administrative startup costs associated with rehiring people. So again, I think the way the program is designed, even though it's not working perfectly just yet, I think what we're going to see is the capability to be able to pull out of this in ways that we just couldn't do 100 years ago.
Let me make just 2 points. One, the Depression was so destructive, not only because production dropped as fast as it did, but because it lasted so long. Mm-hmm. It dismantled parts of the economy and kept them from reassembling. And it wasn't until World War II when a lot of those industries were able to reassemble. So we don't expect this coronavirus depression to last anywhere as long as the Great Depression, even if it goes down as far as they say it will. Second point is, and this is the discouraging part, we haven't yet felt the economic impact of the coronavirus. And I know you're all saying, well, here we are stuck in our house and we can't go anywhere. We're just at the starting line. You know, the things that are happening right now, sort of out there in theory, are going to become real to us over the next year. So brace yourself, because we're going to go through some really tough months here. in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Even with the roughly 17 million folks that are unemployed, we're really not going to start seeing the data components of this probably until May or June. And the numbers are going to be ugly. They're going to be very ugly. Steep drop off. But again, we've got some infrastructure in place that didn't exist in the 1930s. That again, hopefully, will allow us to speed up the process.
Next question is about political stability from Tracy in regards to the industrial north and the global south. With governors taking care of states and federal government claiming total control, a bad economy could be the tipping point and militias have formed on less. How do we work with our economy to bring balance and prosperity across these regions? And what do you see from that perspective?
I guess I'll take this one, Tom.
Yeah.
There are a couple dimensions to that question. I would say, let's start at home. We are definitely seeing some changes within the political balance in the United States. It's not clear exactly how that's going to work out, but we have seen governors take a much more visible position in making decisions for their individual states. There is, and there always is, competition between states and the federal government. That's nothing new in the United States, and I wouldn't expect that a pandemic like this would go smoothly. But we will be working out that relationship between the state level and the federal level as we go forward, because I don't think this is the first time that the president and the governors are going to be in some tension over who makes the decisions about when we open up the economy and how we open up the economy. I don't expect a lot of unrest in the United States, at least not yet, unless this goes for a long time. Let's say a year from now, we still don't have a vaccine. Let's say a year from now, scientists are saying we might not have a vaccine for 5 years or 10 years. Then you might see some real tension because people will become very, very frustrated. I don't think that's going to happen in the United States, but I think it will happen in the global south. I think we're already seeing it. We're seeing riots in India. We're seeing a combination of locust plague and a virus plague in sub-Saharan Africa, which is going to create all kinds of economic and political instability there. Climate change is also contributing to that. So that goes back to these trends that we were seeing before the coronavirus. So I think there were already problems developing in the global south, especially that band around the equator. And that is going to be increasingly difficult for the global community to deal with. So I would say watch for that in the future, because I think there are going to be some very unstable countries over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, that's consistent, I think, with what both Brent and I both talked about, is as we repatriate some of these companies and supply chains back to the developed world, that's going to create a vacuum economically, and likely, as Brent points out, create that political unrest. And I guess we'll have to make that choice as a country. You know, where do we stand now in terms of trying to facilitate that not having a large impact.
And one more point on repatriation, just to underline what I said before. These jobs they're going to be few jobs, and they're going to be jobs that require high skills.
Yeah.
Companies are now, they were before thinking, we really ought to bring some more automation. We ought to use more robots and AI to make our processes more efficient. But they had held off because those are expensive transitions. But now we've got this unsettling situation, and companies are going to say, well, we're just going to go for it now. We're going to bring some of these processes home. We're going to introduce robots. We're going to introduce clean processing centers where no people are involved at all. And that is just going to open up a larger gap between workers who can plug into that system and workers who are left behind. And to Tracy's question, that's a long-term trend in the United States. And, that may lead to more populism. It may lead to more government involvement in addressing the problems of inequality. I hope it does. But that is definitely going to shift the balance between government power and what we let markets do.
Yeah, one of the things that a message that people need to hear, and of course at places like Furman, this is sort of the mantra, and that is lifelong learning, right? This is going to be a time where being open to retooling and those kinds of things is going to be critical. And not a lot of times we think about this in the context of blue collar jobs, but one of the fastest growing areas of unemployment in the country right now is in the white collar sector. And there are robotics and AI being introduced into investment management, the banking world. So we're not talking about just in what we typically think of as that blue collar sector. This is economy wide. Anything that is standard, has a very packaged type of work process can be automated today, and it will be automated. And therefore, lifelong learning and this idea of retooling constantly is important. I personally had to do it when I got to Florida Gulf Coast. Prior to the pandemic starting, I had to teach my first course online. And while it's not my preferred delivery method, thank goodness I went through all the training and the effort back in the fall, because it's proved very beneficial. But I was reluctant. I'm 56 years old. I'm used to teaching in front of a class. But the reality is higher education, as Brent pointed out, is moving to this electronic format. And I think the coronavirus is going to speed that process along. So even, somebody like me has to be conscious of these trends and retool. Problem is, it's uncomfortable to do that, and we've got to sort of break out of that, break out of our comfort zones.
So another question, we've had a couple of comments about different sectors. Robotics was one you already touched on, but the next question, what other countries are going to have similar debt loads as the US after the coronavirus global pandemic, and not just value, but scaled as well?
Yeah, pretty much every country. And in fact, most countries, certainly developed countries, whether it's Japan or European countries, although there are some variations depending on what country, actually have higher debt loads than we do. But that doesn't, just because we're relatively better, doesn't make it good. And really the place that starts to have an impact is in the capital markets. The fact that governments are there soaking up investment that could be going to companies. It's an effect we call crowding out, is significant. And we were already headed down a path of difficult choices. Fastest growing component of the federal budget is interest expense on the existing debt. And I believe by about 2025, the amount of the interest was going to be roughly equal, if not greater, than the amount we currently spend on defense. So now we're adding on top of that additional debt. And yes, interest rates are low now, but interest rates will change. And at some point they'll go back up and we'll have to refinance the debt that we already have. So even in relative terms, growing debt loads, just think about it in your own household. Once you borrow a certain amount, you lose confidence in your ability to repay. The real tipping point will be if investors lose confidence in either the US or some other government to be able to repay its debt. And the closest we really came to that was probably Greece coming out of the 2008 financial crisis.
And just to let everybody know, we've got, we're kind of at our 1 o'clock time. We'll continue on for a few minutes. If anybody needs to go, we certainly understand. We'll go for a little bit longer, so stay with us if you can. The next question was about food production. Currently, food production is being disturbed with farmers plowing crops under. What could the long-term effect be of the disruption in our food markets?
Yeah, I guess we haven't talked about agriculture, and I think that's that is a really important sector of the economy. Right now, we're seeing an imbalance in agriculture. About 50% of food production in the United States that isn't exported goes to restaurants and institutional providers of food. And that comes in big packages and it's sold in different ways. It's sold on long-term contracts. And the other 50% goes to households. Well, now almost no restaurants are open and almost no institutions are providing food. So they're not buying that food. And that's why you're seeing, television stories on TV where milk is being poured out and all of those kinds of things. So we're having to readjust our food production system so that more of that food goes to consumers in households rather than institutional settings. The other thing that's going on with agriculture is that there are more and more countries thinking that they have gotten too dependent on agricultural imports. And so they're looking to grow more of their own food. Now, you can't do that overnight, obviously. But for instance, Britain, which has been very dependent on Europe and other parts of the world to provide food for themselves, are now thinking we need to grow more of this at home so that when there are crises like this, we don't come up short on very basic foodstuffs. So there's a big shift going on in agriculture.
Yeah, I actually think we're going to see some significant innovation on the supply chain component of this, where, as Brent pointed out, you've got some producers that only service restaurants and therefore packaging and bulk and all those kinds of things are critical. I think with an event like this, they're going to look for ways that allow them to switch back and forth between, say the retail market versus the institutional. Here in Southwest Florida, this is a huge issue. There's a lot of farming around where I am with all kinds of products. And we're seeing commercials, public service announcements about, buying more fresh produce at the grocery store. It sounds like a lot of people are doing, say, frozen meals and things like that. So we're seeing that component. But one of the other things is that there are a number of restaurants here locally that are starting to sell their supplies as if they're like a grocery store. So that's another product or delivery innovation that may sort of develop over the course of this for situations exactly like we're facing, where we may not have the capability to be able to go to the restaurant or whatever. So there could be some interesting things that come out of this, but Brent's right. agriculture right now is taking a beating. So it's certainly something that we have to consider going forward.
So Rob comments that one of the red lights on major wars has been the global economy connectivity, keeping it in check through trade and other connectivity. If countries like China and the US are less connected financially and with trade, will this be a precursor to the possibility of major wars?
Gee, Brent, that sounds like a European coal and steel industry expert on this.
It's interesting that Rob mentions that because something I've been thinking about. There is a large number of scholars who would say that the more interconnected the world, the less likely there will be interstate conflicts. But that may be true to an extent, but I think the interesting thing that we have discovered over the last, say, 5 years is that this interconnection with China that everyone thought would, or a lot of people thought would keep us from engaging in real conflict with them, doesn't seem to be doing that. Now, we haven't seen a shooting war, and so we can be very thankful for that, and maybe that is a result of this interconnectedness. But even with the interconnectedness, both through products and the financial markets, we still have tensions in the South China Sea over military installations and over China's desire to create a security zone in Asia. So some of these economic ties are beginning to unravel. That's what Trump did with the trade war, which, by the way, is probably the most popular of his policies nationally. If you look at polling figures, people may not like Trump very much, but they like his attitude towards China. So that's something that will probably continue in the next administration, whichever one that might be. So to answer that question directly, I would say that under any condition of instability, there's always potential for greater conflict. But I would say the greater chances that will be internal to certain countries as they try to work out their own reaction to the crisis. But there's always that potential, and it would certainly be something like U.S. China, U.S. Russia, but probably located in the Middle East or in the South China Sea, not anywhere near the United States.
Speaking of China, Senator Graham has advocated repudiation of U.S. debt to China. What would be the impact on global financial markets if this idea was implemented?
Oh boy. Tom, you want to take that one?
So what's that? I'm not sure I quite understand. Is he essentially suggesting that China will sell the debt? Maybe I misunderstood the question.
The idea to cancel some of the debt to China.
It would be catastrophic financially. And the reason why is the minute you cancel it for one country, it brings in to everyone's mind that it could happen to them. And whether or not that's realistic, it really isn't the issue. It will create that kind of fear in the marketplace in such a way that it would truly be catastrophic in the grand scheme of things. I've made a similar argument for raising the debt ceiling, and I beat up both Republicans and Democrats on this because, yes, as a Republican, you might want to reduce spending and do all those kinds of things and therefore sort of hold up the process for that reason. Democrats would say, well, I want to increase taxes and do this and do that. That's true too. But the reality is, if you don't raise the debt ceiling, like it or not, it would crush the Treasury market instantaneously. Because once you show weakness in the fact that you may not repay that debt, you lose confidence in the system. That's just a fundamental reality. That's also why you've seen the Federal Reserve do everything that they've done in the last 3 weeks. You know, it started with lowering rates, standard plain vanilla monetary policy. Then they stepped in to the commercial paper market. Well, they'd done that in 2008. Then they started stepping back into the mortgage market. Again, another 2008. Then they said, well, we're gonna start buying corporate bonds. Okay, investment grade corporate bonds. Never been done before. Just in the last few days, they've announced that they're going to buy exchange traded funds that invest in junk bonds. The Treasury came out today and announced that the bailout package for the airlines, which strategically we need to do, is going to be a combination of grants, loans, and equity investments in those airlines. And there's been talk of the Federal Reserve buying equity in companies that they provide loans to and things like that. So all of those things that the Federal Reserve has been doing has been to instill confidence in the financial system. So if the government takes a stand that, you know, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling or we're going to cancel debt to China, the consequences would just be catastrophic to the system.
So I think we have time for one last question. What will the effect of the U.S. deficit have on inflation?
Oh boy, that's a good question. If you would have listened to one of my lectures while I was still at Furman 10 years ago, I've been banging on this drum for a while. One would expect inflation. It has not materialized. One of the concerns that I have right now is that there seems to be an idea, not only from markets and the populace, but even among central bankers, that inflation is dead. I think we take that approach at our peril. I just think that's a bit of an arrogant approach. I don't see how, increasing the deficit and the debt load by 25% and repatriating supply lines cannot lead to inflation. Now, right now, we actually need some inflation. But my concern is, will we be able to manage it once we get it back to some normal range? But quite frankly, I've been wrong for 10 years, which is probably why I'm teaching and supposed to lots of money in the financial markets.
Well, great. Any closing thoughts, Brent, Tom?
I would just say that, we're at the very beginning of this. We have really no idea how things are going to pan out, and we could be very surprised. So I'm grateful to anyone who wants to listen to these kind of uninformed thoughts about the future. But I do think that if there's one point you should get out of this, it's that a crisis like this will exacerbate or amplify certain trends that were occurring before the crisis. And so that's where you look to find how things might change in the future. You look for those past trends and see which ones will get amplified. And that's what the world will look like in the future.
Yeah, just as an extension of that, as those things are being amplified, I think what we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is an absolute explosion in innovation, not like we've seen really probably since the introduction of the internet. Now, it may not be in one thing like the internet, but think about, you know, all these different vaccine trials that are going on. Some of them are going to fail as it applies to the coronavirus, but maybe they'll lead to a cure for certain types of cancer. We've already talked about restaurants selling grocery goods. So different ways to do business. I think I actually have a lot of hope that going forward, while we're going through this now, I really believe that we're going to see just a massive explosion in innovation as we go forward. And quite frankly, that's what I'm sort of hanging my hat on right now, is that hope that we'll get to the other side and be better for it, both individually, but also as a country.
I think that's a nice note to close on. Thanks everybody for sticking with us. This has been the first, part of a series. So the next event that Upstate International hopes you will join us for is going to be on April 22nd from noon to 1. Weston Drips will be presenting for the Earth Day's 50th anniversary, celebrating 50 years of Earth Day amidst the COVID-19 crisis. And for additional details, please visit our website at World Affairs Council Upstate. Thanks to everybody who attended and for sticking with us a little over our allotted time. Thanks to Brent and Tom for sharing their expertise. I look forward to our next event.
Thank you.
Goodbye all.
Stay
Thank
safe
you.
and healthy.